Hello, thank you. First, I want to thank everybody who put so much effort into putting this together. This is a really great 2 days, and I'm really honored to be here as part of it. I'd also like to give a special thanks to the tech crew that's supporting us over the 2 days, Josh and Stephanie. It's been so smooth, which I just jinxed us probably. But I also like to say this is the best laser pointer I've ever used. All right, so I, like Howard, will undoubtedly get through half of my presentation, but we'll do our best. So the title is Considering High Definition Video, a primer for museums and curators, also known as the black hole that is HD video. And I wanted to start off by just taking a quick poll of how many people, with raise of hands, have been in a conversation at some point where the term HD was being thrown around and you didn't really know what people were talking about, but you figured everybody else did and you didn't want to be the one who didn't know. How many? Okay, a lot of people. I'm in that group too. And that's for good reason. So, you know, common responses to what HD is are along these lines, and you know, kind of the first one at the top is what you generally run into. It's this sense that everybody knows what it is, why even ask? And then you kind of run into these vague notions of aspect ratio and, you know, the marketing terms that get thrown around, the 1080 and the 720 and progressive scan, and it's really high resolution, right? So it's got to have higher frame rates. Well, you know, this is from the New York News in 1949. I'll point out that it's just across the river in Long Island City too, so anybody who has $299.95 may get lucky and be able to get such a set. So Mark Shubin, who I'll just say is, you know, he's a video genius, basically. He's a really well-known expert in the field. I wanted to read a quote from him where he says, "History records October 25th, 1925 as the first time a live recognizable image of a human face was carried from a video camera to a video display. Within a few years, the term high-definition television appeared. After all, if early images had just 8 scanning lines, then 60 were surely enough for high definition. In 1935, the British government defined HD TV as having at least 240 scan lines." So it's the same reason that you can be in a discussion and not know what people are talking about when they say HD. And how is it that all these cameras can be HD, ranging from $150 to tens of thousands of dollars? And I guarantee you that when your relative tells you that they just bought an HD camera, they're not talking about this one. And I guarantee, and Peter Jackson didn't make a movie using this one. So we start to get the idea that saying something is HD is a lot like saying someone is really cool. It begs some questions, reference points, and a lot more detail. So these terms by themselves are ambiguous and relative. This is all to say that the term HD isn't really useful by itself. You shouldn't assume, and you shouldn't be shy to in that next conversation, speak up and say, what exactly are you talking about? And to start talking specifications. So let's start putting these things together, this landscape. So you kind of run into a few different things here, but so this big bubble in the middle, HD, is what we'll just use as our center point. And we run into a couple of important standards in DTV, the digital television standards from ATSC, or Advanced Television Systems Committee, which you'll recognize the TSC from NTSC, which is National Television Systems Committee, a similar organization. So they put together standards for HD TV and SD TV for digital television. HD TV is intended specifically for broadcast purposes and follows a distinct set of specifications that I'll get into. We have this other HD video that we'll talk about. which meets some of the specifications of HDTV maybe, but fails to in others. And then we have greater than HD, and it's halfway in this circle, and this is grayed out because we'll come to find that that term may or may not have any actual use. HD may be all we need, or it depends on your interpretation of how these standards break down. So let's start with HDTV. And like I just said, it depends on how it breaks down. This is from Charles Poynton, if there's two people you're gonna read anything about digital video, Charles Poynton and Mark Shubin would be the ones. Charles Poynton, who wrote a book, Digital Video and HDTV, says, surprisingly, there's no broad agreement on definitions of standard definition television and high definition television. And this is where we get into some gray areas, like I was just talking about. So he classifies standard definition TV as anything with fewer than 3/4 million pixels, and anything over as HDTV. And he says any video system with a native aspect ratio of 16:9. So that's a good point of reference to use. So here's kind of the original. I've chopped off the SDTV portions of the specifications, and we're just looking at HDTV. So HDTV started out being MPEG-2 based, and the standard is, you can go on to atsc.org and download the entire standard. They have all these standards online. So this one's A53, and it defines the initial standards. And these are them. So they say that we got 1080 by 1920, our aspect ratio is 16:9. Now, square versus non-square pixels, I'm going to take the path that our friend did yesterday and say I'm not going to get into that today, but it's something that you should read more. I have a long list at the end that I'll show you well, you'll see it online when this gets distributed, but of things you should research further, and pixel aspect ratio is one of them. Progressive, interlaced, so we have a distinction here, and then the frame rates that go along with those. So notably in this, we don't have 1080 60p, right? We only have 1080 60i, and this was true up until recently when we moved into a new standard being published, which did a couple of things. We got some greater capabilities within the standard. We also moved to MPEG-4, H.264 AVC, Advanced Video Coding. So this gave us a broader set of things. We see 1440 come into the mix, non-square pixel. That's an important thing that I'll maybe reference later. So these are the standards that are HDTV. These are them. When you can't, if you're talking about anything other than meeting these standards, you're not talking about HDTV specifically. So, and I should say that within these standards, there's also maximum bit rates and things. So that, these MPEG-2 and MPEG-4 compression, and they have maximum bit rates. Now what happened was broadcasters got the ability to broadcast in HD, and they said, hold on a second, I can do 120 megabit per second HDTV, or I can do 4 or 5 megabit per second standard definition television streams. I'll do standard def, and that's why that's why it took so long to get into to HDTV truly being broadcast, because broadcasters wanted to broadcast more standard def channels instead. So 20 megabits per second is 20 to 40, it depends, but generally speaking, 20 megabits per second is the data rate of HDTV. So I'm going to jump in and out of the presentation. We'll see how smoothly this goes. So this gives us some sense of the comparison. I want to go to an actual TIFF so we can zoom in on that. All right, there we go. And we're on, to make things go smoothly here, we went to VGA. So well, this will work. All right. So we can see relatively speaking, we see that this is a lot clearer than this, right? So we're looking at the difference between 1080p and 1080i, and as we move further, we see less and less detail. And I grabbed this is a shot I grabbed from Wikipedia, actually. So this gives us the relative comparison of detail or resolution in a shot, and this is just another shot where we see the same things. So can everybody see that there's a lot less, that this starts to look a lot blockier and less detailed than this, or is that hard to tell from there? All right. You can really see it, start to see it here clearly. All right, let me see how easily I can jump back into this. So our summary is, there's a whole set of documents, but generally speaking, we can kind of summarize the primary characteristics of HD TV. So we're not just talking general HD, we're talking HD TV, using these. So we start to see these pixel counts. We see MPEG-2 and MPEG-4, H.264, and we see 20 to 40 megabits per second. So let's look at other HD video, and this is where things start to get interesting. So other HD video, how it's defined is really up to whoever, it's up to the individual interpretation. These are different ways you could define it, and the people might argue. One is just purely over 750,000 pixels, and we get that pixel count right by doing, when we say 1920 by 1080, we get that pixel count, and I have a chart on the next slide that shows us that. But others would say, well, HD, we would reference 1920 by 1080, people would use as the HD reference, really referring specifically to HD TV. And so when people say greater than HD, what they're generally saying is greater than HD TV. But it just gets thrown around generally speaking. So this is some people's interpretation, and that's where we get that greater than HD, which would be things like 2K and 4K. And then, some people would argue that it's 16:9 aspect ratio, and some people would say it could be any aspect ratio as long as it's over 750,000 pixels. So that's why it gets hard even in standard definition when you start talking pixel counts versus aspect ratios. People want to put the boundaries in different places. So this is just to give you some idea of pixel counts here and aspect ratio variations that we see. So the common ones being, 1.78 to 1 or 16:9 and 4:3 up here. But we have a wide variety of aspect ratios that we could use. So anything that kind of meets, really falls in between any mix of these things could be theoretically defined as other HD video or be generally referred to as HD. And I'd say this is where we have some bit rate specification with HD TV, and that leaves a lot to be desired. That's still a low bit rate with perception of HD compared to reality there. But with other HD, there's none. So this is where we get really you see these little cameras that are $150, and I'll say they look great compared to what we've had in the past shooting with the VHS camcorder or a Hi8 or something. They actually look really nice, but you also have some really bad ones too, and that's and they can call themselves HD because there is no standardized compression scheme and there's no standardized bit rate. And to give an example of that, I wanted to play this video here. So we see this is just showing what Howard was talking about, but basically we see the variation between something that's still fairly highly compressed and something that's lower compressed. So these are technically both HD, though. Technically, if you use a broad interpretation, they're both 1920 by 1080 line counts or pixel counts. So both of those could fall under the other HD category. Let's get back to the presentation. All right. So, sorry. Okay, so there's also no specified color space, no chroma subsampling, no bit depth. There's basically no specifications. People generally refer to HD as 16 by 9 or maybe not aspect ratio, and 1920 by 1080 or 720 by, so we start seeing that other HD video falls into the category of being the Wild West, which is why we can have this broad range of interpretation, and we can see things and look at it and go, boy, that looks horrible. How can they call that HD? That's why. So the next area would be that greater than HD, or what I'm calling 2K, 4K, and greater than 4K. We're starting to see higher and higher resolution scanning abilities come out. And just to give a couple of examples, so there's a camera called the Red camera, which has been out for a few years now, highly popular, really widely adopted, fairly relatively cheap compared to what preceded it that had similar quality, and it can shoot in 2K, 4K, and HD, and this shows the relative pixel, the dimensions and size here. So this would be like a born digital file, and you'll notice one thing about 2K and 4K is that while this we see 2304 by 4096. We see 2K and 4K, and someone referred to a 2K scan, what the dimensions were yesterday. And then we see other, the Spirit Data Cine film scanner, we see slightly different specifications. So this is, it's not, there isn't one 2K or one 4K spec. There are multiple that might be used, yielding various aspect ratios, but so it 2K and 4K specifically refer to the pixel count, right? And then we have, so we have kind of the Red camera would be like a born digital, right? It shoots directly to 2K, 4K. The Spirit Data Cine film scanner would be scanning moving image film at 2K or 4K. And then I threw in the Aja IO HD, which is a fairly low cost video, A to D converter and interface. Which has what it refers to as 2K and 4K. Now these all are different video. It's all different processing. We're talking about here. We're talking about interlace and progressive, various YUV versus RGB and all these things. So they're not the same thing, and they shouldn't be considered to be. But we start to see the range of things that are referred to as 2K and 4K. So it was to give you some sense of terminology here and give you some reference points when you're entering into conversations with people. So we start to see where this goes. And now YouTube has actually implemented 4K resolution. And I mean, it's pretty remarkable, actually, when you watch the videos, what it now looks like compared to what it used to look like. But it goes again to show, there isn't obviously YouTube is applying a very high level of compression compared to what the Red camera is doing compared to what the Data Cine scanner is doing. So compression is always, you understand, we do like Howard talked about, we do the sampling at all those pixel, at each pixel, and then we add compression. So the compression is often not referred to, so it's definitely a point that needs to be discussed. So paths to HD, and I'm including 2K and 4K in this, we have legacy standard definition like U-matic, like Maurice was talking about. We have film scanning, and we have born digital as some options into HD. First, let's go over legacy standard definition. And the first thing I wanted to point out is, there's this perception that when we do what's called up-resing or up-converting from SD to HD, that we actually increase our resolution, and the reality is that's not correct. So here we have, the original was 480 by 640, and I up-res to 1080 by 1440, and we see that, in fact, what's happened is it's degraded the quality, which is what we would expect. So you you're never going to get something better than the original. When you process something, there's a degradation that occurs. So we see more clearly the pixels here on the original, and then we start to see a lot, some blurring, some smoothing, so a loss of detail compared to the original. So we actually lose integrity. It's not even as good as the original when we move to HD. Now, if I played you those two clips at full resolution, you probably wouldn't notice, but at thinking in the context of conservation, these are important things to consider. So no, we don't have increased resolution when we up-res. So Howard referred to aspect ratios as being another important consideration, and there are various ways that we can go from standard definition to high definition, going from a 4:3 aspect ratio to a 16:9, and these represent some of those ways. Actually, I'll play a clip here. Let's see. So this is just a quick little clip that will play. I wanted to have some moving image. And this, I should thank Rick Prellinger for letting us use this clip. This is from his collection. And it's not the best clip to use because it's film that's gone through the telecine process, but it gets the point across. So, and it's 4:3 aspect ratio. So we see a crop, right? So we actually lose detail. We're actually cutting out part of the picture. The other one was pillar boxed, which gives us the two black bars on the side. This is something that you see very disconcertingly. You see a lot. We're also having a lot of artifacts in there that aren't on my screen. That's, I guess, part of the playback. So this is actually not cropped or pillar boxed. It's just 1440 by 1080. So we up-resed without changing the aspect ratio. Now this is a product of basically round tripping. When you SD to HD and then back to SD pillar boxing, you end up with a black box around the whole thing. And you see that sometimes. And then same thing with round tripping, cropping. So we crop when we go from SD to HD, and we crop when we go back to SD, and we actually cut out a large portion of the image. So again, just for comparison, so the question kind of becomes, well, why would you, if we can do this, SD to HD, no crop, no pillar box, why wouldn't you do that? This takes up extra space, right? This is extra storage right here. Even though it's pretty easy to compress, it's all black, it's still extra storage. Cropping is obviously not ideal. So why wouldn't we just do this? And the answer is basically, one, you might want to do this if you have control and you can set it up yourself. But when we lose controls and we're just sending a clip into the world, this gives us some control over how it would be presented. Now, sure, someone can mess it up, but putting the pillar boxes in here or cropping it to go ahead and turn it into a 16:9 will lessen the risk of it being distorted when played back. For instance, I tried to put this clip, that series of clips that I just played you, I tried to put that together in Final Cut. And Final Cut, because HD follows HDTV standards, which says that the only 1440 configuration is a non-square pixel, so Final Cut would only accept this non-cropped, non-pillar boxed clip by stretching it out. There was no setting I could do to change that, so it actually wouldn't let me use it in a non-distorted fashion. So I had to actually go into iTunes to play it back, which uses QuickTime, which would recognize it and play it back correctly. So other considerations, deinterlacing, right? This is something that we run into a lot. We've heard interlace versus progressive, and we have artifacts occur as a result of that. So here we have the original, and there's actually some deinterlacing that occur there, and then these are different. These are different mechanisms. I want to show you a close-up of that. All right. So we can see the different, this is, again, we're having a lot of artifacts here that I guess it's just from the playback system, but it's hard to see the details of that. I think I have a TIFF I can show you that may help. Yeah, so this uses 4 different, we have the original here, and then the various ones, and you can actually see some line shift. See that? So what deinterlacing is doing is, I can't see which one that is. I think that's average. So there's a number of ways you can deinterlace, and actually deinterlacing is getting more and more sophisticated. It used to be very crude. You just cut out half the lines and you duplicate the other half. Then we got a little bit more sophisticated. There was averaging that would do an average of the two. Now there's a few out there, and the last one was one of them. In Final Cut, it's called motion compensated. There's some called YADIF, Y-A-D-I-F. And what they do is they actually apply deinterlacing only when it's needed. So there's detection where there would be deinterlacing artifacts, and it applies it where those artifacts would occur. So it gets more intelligent. However, we're talking about exhibition here. We would never want to deinterlace our original, right? We want to maintain the integrity of the original. It puts us in a bit of a quandary because, as we've discussed, CRTs, which are interlace displays, are rapidly going away. So we will very soon be in the position, although Maurice gives me some hope with talks of new displays coming out that can handle interlace, but we could potentially be in a position where we have tons of, everything that's legacy that you can think of, any tape that you can think of, digibeta and before is going to be interlaced. So we have tons of content that's in interlace that we face it, not being able to watch on a screen that can actually represent it properly. And it's interesting, I started to think part of my charge was to discuss the implications of HD, and I actually think the bigger considerations is implications of SD. I mean, we're in a place you can barely buy a camera that will shoot in SD. You can barely find a display that's SD. You can't find. So our bigger concern is actually implications of SD. Implications of HD are what everybody's hyper focused on would be, our storage capacity requirements. So frame rate conversion is another consideration, and I'll jump in and out of here quickly. This is we often hear about converting from 24 frames per second to 2997, or I got the red blinking light already. All right.
If you can take number 5.
Okay. Yep. So I want to just I'm going to step through this frame by frame so you can see what happens here. So on the right we have our original is 2997. I dropped it to 24, and then I dropped it to 12. So you can see what happens. You can see as I step through frame by frame that there's frames. This one will move every time. This one will move every couple of times, and this one will move every third time. So we start to see that, and that we actually lose. You can start to see it's actually. If we play it in real time, you will notice some variance, that things don't look quite right when you play back to 12 frames per second. It looks jerky, but it's, when you go in the frame level like that, you can really start to see what's going on. So it makes you start thinking about changing frame rates around, even for exhibition purposes. All right, so let me just get through this. So film digitization, I'll just say that there's kind of this disturbing trend that continues where even with newer conversion systems that are coming out that do film digitization, and they're framed as they're correctly generally framed as access oriented, which is the right way to think about it. That do go through the telecine process, which it basically involves a conversion process that affects both the frame rate. We go from the original frame rate, 24, let's say 24 frames per second, to 2997, and we convert color spaces, and we move from progressive, which film is progressive, to interlaced. But there's lots of people that are using these devices to actually, for preservation of film, and I'm not quite sure why we're still doing that. I don't understand why we should be able to, with today's technology, to actually be outputting. I think it's about just hanging on to broadcast and interlaced, since so much of broadcast is still interlaced, that people are thinking along those lines. But we really don't want to do that. We want to stay progressive. We want to stay in our original frame rate, and we want to stay in our color space. An HD consideration, especially with HD, is niche or proprietary formats. When we get into these really high resolutions, we're talking about specialized systems generally that require proprietary codecs and wrappers and things that are not necessarily easy. And there's no quick fix to that right now. There hasn't, we can look to things like a digital cinema initiative, or efforts going on with MXF and JPEG 2000 at the Library of Congress and stuff, but these things are still emerging. There's things that are unattractive about the digital cinema stuff for this domain. So it puts us in a little bit of a quandary and makes you want to kind of take a backseat on looking at film digitization as generating archive masters. Unless you have the infrastructure to support it, it requires a significant one. So I'm just going to go through all these. They're just some various formats that we see come in. I guess we can look at, these are various tape-based, and what's interesting, these are tape-based, right? So fortunately, we have the luxury of potentially storing them, but although tapes fall into the same niche and proprietary, or at least not widely adopted, there's sustainability factors that really cause some concern. There aren't, in the US anyway, there aren't a lot of HD cam SR decks. They tend to be in high-end post-production facilities. These decks, now you can get them for less, but we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, or around $100,000. It's not necessarily going to be easy. There's not as many HD cam SR decks as there were digibetas in the world. These are, you start to see a lot of HDV and DVC Pro HD, but D5, HD cam SR, D6, there's just not that many of. But you take a look at if we were storing this in its native format on a server, we're talking about significant file sizes. I'm going to get kicked off here in a second. So I just want to go over file sizes real quickly to give you some order of magnitude here. 2K at 444, RGB, we're talking about 1 terabyte per hour. 4K, we're talking about 6.15 terabytes per hour. And then we get into the nifty, Apple's ProRes and Avid's DNxHD, which are high def formats that are visually really appealing, do efficient compression, and we end up here. But we're worried about the sustainability factors associated with those. And then of course, we have Flip HD just as a comparison. So then you start to think about all the stuff that Howard was talking about managing these things and obsolescence factors. And I'll just, this will all be online, but I felt tortured by all the things I wasn't going to tell you today. So I made a list of a bunch of them here, which you'll have available to you. And I would highly recommend that you research those topics at least a little bit to get the vocabulary and terminology down. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.